November 1943. Aiea Naval Hospital, Pearl Harbor. The ward smelled of antiseptic and salt air and the particular stillness of a room where men were trying very hard not to move. Chester Nimitz walked through the door in his admiral's uniform, and the nurses stepped back, and those who could sit up did, and those who could not remained where they were, flat on their backs under white sheets in the morning light coming through the windows above the harbor. He had been here before. He came here after every major engagement. He moved from bed to bed the way he moved through everything, without announcement, without theater, stopping at each one long enough to mean it. In a bed near the far wall lay a 19-year-old. He had come off a beach in the Gilbert Islands 4 days earlier. The Navy physicians had done what they could do, which was not enough. He was going to leave this ward, and he was not going to leave it on his feet. When Nimitz reached him and stood beside the bed, the young man looked up, and what he asked was the question that every man in that ward was carrying somewhere beneath the pain and the morphine and the exhaustion. He asked if it was worth it. Nimitz did not look away. He did not summon a prepared answer. He sat down beside the bed and he told the young man what he believed to be true. What he said and how he said it and what it cost him to say it is the story of what the Pacific War actually required of the man who commanded it. Chester Nimitz had been carrying the weight of the Pacific War's casualties since Christmas morning of 1941, when he stepped off a boat into Pearl Harbor and counted what it had already cost before he had given a single order. By November 1943, 2 years into the war and 3 months past the grinding island battles of the Central Pacific Campaign, the accounting had grown enormous. The Battle of Tarawa had ended 5 days before he visited Aiea. In 76 hours of fighting on an island roughly the size of a city park, nearly 1,000 Marines and sailors had perished. More than 2,000 had been wounded. The photographs had reached the American public, unlike the photographs from earlier battles, and the country's reaction was loud and raw. Headlines called it a bloodbath. Mothers wrote letters to their senators, and some of them wrote letters to Chester Nimitz. His personal aide, Lieutenant Commander H. Arthur Lamar, tried to intercept those letters. He understood what was in them before he opened them, and he understood what they would do to the man who had to read them. Nimitz found out what Lamar was doing and ordered it stopped. He told Lamar that reading those letters was one of the responsibilities of command. He said that you have to send some people to their deaths, and when you do not get to avoid hearing from the people who love them. If you want more stories from the Pacific War about the weight of command that the strategy books never mention, the human cost that a commander carries alone in a room at 2 in the morning, make sure you subscribe to this channel. These are the stories that happened after the battle reports were filed. The letters came from everywhere. One came from a mother in Arkansas. She wrote 4 words that Nimitz read and then read again. "You took my son." He wrote back to her. He wrote back to all of them, personally, in his own hand, because he believed that a man who orders other men into battle owes the families of those men at least the dignity of being answered by the person who gave the order. He wrote to his wife Catherine during this period and said he was receiving 2 or 3 letters a day calling him names. He said he was as distressed as he could be about the casualties and did not see how he could have reduced them. In a later letter, he wrote that he prayed for the war to end, to stop the killing and the maiming. He used both words. He was precise about the difference between them. The weight the letters represented was not abstract for Nimitz. It was physical. His aide and his personal physician both documented it. The stress of command manifested in ways that a man who spent his weekends pitching horseshoes and hiking the hills above Pearl Harbor would not have otherwise exhibited. He lost weight. He suffered from insomnia, lying awake in the cottage above the ocean while the trade winds moved through the screens and the war continued somewhere over the horizon. He carried a kind of controlled grief that he allowed almost no one to see directly, because a Pacific fleet of 4 million men and 1,000 ships required its commander to be composed, and so he was composed, and the grief went somewhere else, which was inside. His own son was in the Pacific. Chester Nimitz Jr. commanded a submarine, the USS Hado. and the father knew exactly what a submarine patrol in Japanese-controlled waters involved, because he had spent years in the submarine service himself and had once commanded a vessel not unlike the one his son was now taking into the deep water off Japan's home islands. He knew what the depth charges sounded like from inside the hull. He knew the particular silence that fell in a submarine after a close one, the silence in which you checked yourself for injury and checked the gauges and waited to see if another one was coming. He knew what it meant when letters stopped arriving for a while, and he knew how to wait out those silences without letting them surface in the daily operations of a war that required him to be the same man every morning. He prayed for his son the way he prayed for all of them, without distinguishing between the ones he knew by name and the ones he had ordered into battle through a chain of command, long enough that he would never meet them. Because in his accounting, they were the same kind of responsibility, held to the same standard of care, and carried in the same interior space that had no name but whose presence was constant. He visited the hospitals as often as the war allowed: Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the forward bases across the Central Pacific. He went because he believed it was required of him, not as public relations, but as personal accountability. He awarded Purple Hearts at bedsides. He shook hands with men who had lost hands. He stood beside those who would not leave the hospital. After Tarawa, he visited the ward at the Hawaii hospital where the men who had been blinded were recovering. He moved from bed to bed in that ward the way he moved through the others, stopping at each one, speaking quietly, identifying himself to each man in turn. What he did not expect, and what he described afterward in terms that suggested it had affected him more than nearly anything else in 2 years of war, was what happened when he spoke. Each man, when told who was there, reached up with his hands into the air above the bed and groped for him in the darkness that had replaced the world, not asking for anything, not saying anything, just reaching. He gave them his hands, all of them. He stood at each bed and let the blinded men hold the hands of the man who had sent them to the island that had taken their sight, and he did not move until each man was ready to release him. He went back to the ward at Aiea. He sat beside the 19-year-old from the Gilbert Islands. The young man was alert enough to look at him and ask. The question came quietly, without accusation. It came the way a 19-year-old asks something when he is lying in a hospital bed and has recently understood that there are things he wants to know before the opportunity to ask them is gone. Is it worth it? Nimitz told him what he believed. He said he was proud of the young man's courage. He said that what the Marines had done on that island had opened something that needed to be opened, that the road to the end of the war ran through places like this one, and those who held such places open at the highest cost made it possible for everyone who came after them to advance. Those advances would end the war. He said he believed that fully. He said he wished with everything in him that fewer had been required to pay that price. He said he meant it, and the way he said it made clear that it was not a rehearsed comfort, but a conclusion he had reached in the sleepless hours after the battle reports came in. He sat with him until it was time to move on. The young man died that day, with, according to the nurses who were present, an expression of some peace on his face. Whether it was peace that Nimitz had given him, or peace that came from something beyond what any admiral could offer a 19-year-old, no one in that room could say. What the nurses recorded was that someone had sat beside him and had not looked away, and that the man who sat beside him wore 4 stars on his collar and had answered the question honestly. The public controversy over Tarawa did not subside quickly. Congressional investigators demanded explanations for why so many had perished on an island that fit inside a city park. The newspapers ran casualty figures in the kind of headlines that generated letters to Washington. Nimitz was inundated from 2 directions simultaneously: from above, where the political pressure to justify the operation's cost was unrelenting, and from below, where the letters from grieving families arrived every morning in Lamar's hands, and then, because Lamar had been ordered to stop intercepting them, in Nimitz's. Nimitz gave the same answer privately that he gave to the dying young man, in essentially the same terms. He said the island had to be taken. He said the lessons learned at Tarawa saved lives at Kwajalein and Saipan and every island after it. He said he was as distressed about the casualties as anyone could be, and he said he did not see how he could have reduced them. He did not add that the question of reduction had occupied him through every night he lay awake after the battle, because that was not a thing he put in letters to senators. He continued to visit the hospitals. He continued to read the letters. He continued to write back. His aide Lamar, who spent the war at his side and knew him as well as anyone in the Pacific Fleet, described Nimitz's hospital visits in terms that he said he could not fully explain. He said that Nimitz went into those wards and came out carrying something that he carried for the rest of the day, and probably longer, but that whatever the weight was, it never made him shorter or slower or less present to the next man who needed his attention. He said it was the most precise description he could give of what command looked like from close range, and that he had never seen another officer carry it the same way. Nimitz survived the war. He outlived it by more than 20 years, dying in 1966, and in those years he gave speeches and accepted honors and dedicated museums and sat for interviews in which he was asked about Midway and Guadalcanal and the Missouri and the surrender. He rarely spoke about the hospitals, the ward at Aiea after Tarawa, the blinded men reaching for his hands, the 19-year-old from the Gilbert Islands who asked him a question that had no comfortable answer and received an honest one. He kept those inside the same way he kept everything that cost him something real. What he left in the record was this: a man who understood that the privilege of command, the maps on the wall, and the carriers in the harbor and the subordinates who stood at attention when he walked in, was inseparable from the accountability of command, which was the letters from mothers and the blinded men reaching in the dark, and the question, asked in a quiet voice in a hospital ward by a boy who was 19 years old and had already given everything the war could ask of him. There is a question here that does not resolve cleanly, which is why it has stayed with everyone who has thought carefully about what Nimitz carried. A man can be right about the strategic necessity of a battle and still be confronted at a bedside with the specific human price of having been right. Nimitz understood both things simultaneously. He did not use one to cancel the other. He sat with both of them in the ward, in the sleepless nights. In the letters he wrote back to the mothers who told him what he had done to their sons. Could you have done the same? Walked into that ward and answered that question honestly, knowing what the honest answer would cost? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more stories about the Pacific War and the men who carried it, make sure you subscribe.